Napoleon's reasons for invading Iberia were many and varied, and no doubt seemed pretty reasonable at the time, but they were now running aground against the realities of campaigning in hostile lands defended by an equally hostile populace. Of the 5 flying columns unleashed on the Spanish juntas in June 1808, only one, under Marshal Bessières, had achieved any kind of success. Moncey, Douai and Vedel had all been bested, Lecce's Italian division was annihilated, and the most humiliating of all, Dupint's entire corps had surrendered under arms after defeat at Milan. The Andalusian debacle, as well as setbacks in Spain more generally, put the lie to the invincibility of Napoleon's Grande Armée, reinvigorating his opponents in Iberia and the rest of Europe. Already Great Britain had been making moves to intervene proactively in continental affairs, and with the Spanish juntas intact and fighting back, here was a promising opening. For Napoleon, it was a worst-case scenario. His Iberian ulcer was oozing, but if the British intervened, it could prove decisive, bursting that boil. The British were coming. Question was, where would they land? Portugal seemed to be the best bet, and so Napoleon pressed his man on the ground, Andos Junot, to set the table for guests. The last we saw La Tempête, he had just invaded Portugal, seized Lisbon, and installed himself as military governor. Junot's tenure didn't get off to a flying start. As we saw, the ruling Braganza dynasty fled to Brazil, leaving Junot in possession of a country that wasn't too happy that their rulers had skipped town, but by that same token weren't about to submit to dominion under the French Empire. Resistance was widespread and intractable, and through their heavy-handed occupation the French weren't winning hearts and minds. Looting, rampaging and pillaging had run unchecked for the first few days of the occupation, until Junot regained control. Indeed, he was finding that the task of pacifying and then governing a hostile nation was more than he'd bargained for, despite all possible advantages. Initially, Junot's policy was one of toleration and moderation. He attempted to reconcile with the few remaining councillors and ministers to allay popular fears of brutal repression and keep his troops encamped and away from the populace. After the initial furor had died down, this policy was bearing fruit. Junot's benevolent proclamations were taken as hot air, but the sequestering of the troops meant the Portuguese did not rise up in open rebellion, beyond the usual low simmer of non-compliance and agitation against a foreign power. Collaborators were found for regional and national administration. The basis of the French occupation was flimsy, but it was there and it was growing. When Junot reported his progress with satisfaction, Napoleon's stomach churned. In his own experience and opinion, a harsh repression was the basis for a long-term occupation. Constitutions, reforms, and good government came only after there was order. Fearing he had no choice, Junot reversed course and deferred to instructions from Napoleon, written on December 20th. Quote, "Remove from the country the princes of the House of Braganza, the Portuguese generals and admirals, and any individuals who have served as ministers or hold sufficient sway to serve as rallying points. Disarm the country entirely and leave no line troops behind. Encamp your troops in strong, unified positions. Health and safety will be the result. This is the means to be the master of Portugal and to do as you please. I order that artillery and engineering officers be sent to you. As for the navy, work to complete the ship that is under construction in Lisbon. Have others of our 74 and 80-gun models put into construction. Have the remaining ships assembled and armed with the officers I have sent you, along with the Portuguese, French, Danish, and all other national gunners and crews. Not only collect all taxes, but also establish a special levy, so that you lack for nothing. I need not advise you to take good care of your troops, for your army must be in such a position that it can move elsewhere. Take this opportunity to seize all English property, such as houses, vineyards, and shops. Confiscate all English goods and seize everything related to their trade. I expect to receive a detailed report soon on the roads, the fortresses, and anything else that might help me to understand the country. Disarm Lisbon as much as possible. Experience tells me that a large city that has not been subdued after an insurrection does not consider itself conquered. Establish a commander of arms and harsh police service. Disarm everyone. Make certain that if you do not complete all these orders I have given you with great vigour, you will have cause to repent it." The tonal shift in the French occupation was felt immediately as Junot enacted his orders. The Portuguese army was disarmed and either pressed into French service or dispatched to Bayonne. Naval reinforcements sailed into Lisbon while the Tagus River forts were garrisoned. A 100 million franc special levy, as instructed, was raised. Property belonging to either British persons or businesses, and all properties and assets held by those supporting the Braganças, was seized. Flying columns were then sent out into the countryside, first to scour for valuables, then to requisition supplies. Where resistance was encountered, it was crushed with swift retribution. Cases of rebellion and revolt were handled by military tribunal. Between heavy fines and the threat of death, the Portuguese, from peasant up onto official, chafed under Junot's harsh rule. Yet the man himself considered this period temporary and transitional, the stick coming before the carrot. French laws, a constitution, modern institutions, all, he stated, would pacify the Portuguese long term. For obvious reasons, brutal oppression, the sudden imposition of the continental system, and the harsh levy, Junot's optimism was misplaced. Napoleon counselled against it. Quote, "Do not seek popularity in Lisbon, nor try to please the country. That will only defeat your purpose, embolden the people, and bring misfortune upon you. For the time being, it is impossible to do anything for them that will equal the state of peace and commerce they were in. The Portuguese will complain, but above all, your army must lack for nothing." Napoleon sensed that an uprising was likely, perhaps even desirable if crushed ruthlessly. For that reason, he ordered 4,000 reinforcements to Portugal, as well as extra provisions. To Minister of War Guillaume Clark, he instructed, quote, "In addition to his 24 ounces of bread and field rations, each soldier must have a bottle of wine every day. A complete set of clothing must be provided to the entire army, including a smock, gaiters, and 2 pairs of shoes as a gratuity, with none of these items being deducted from the general clothing and footwear allowance." Junot dutifully followed his orders, but persisted, on the down low, with a policy of reconciliation. A provisional government was established, formed entirely of Portuguese ministers who bent the knee. At Junot's insistence, in April 1808, a deputation was sent to Bayonne to confer on the future of Portugal and the possibility of self-rule. Toying with the idea of enacting the land clauses of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon proposed annexation or dismemberment for Portugal, to the horror of the delegation. Junot was not spared his own rebukes for this and other supposed failures. Quote, "I find your course of action flawed because it lacks foresight. You act like men who have no experience of conquest, indulging in vain illusions. All the people before you are your enemy. As soon as the sea becomes navigable, you will have Englishmen on your shores and intrigues in your provinces. Then all the resources you have left to the Portuguese will turn against you. For after all, the Portuguese nation is brave. I therefore reiterate that my firm intention is that 1. The country be occupied by my troops. 2. The country be disarmed. 3. All Portuguese troops be sent to France in columns of 800 men. And 4. All princes, ministers, and other men who can serve as rallying points be sent to France." For as much as Napoleon might have done to provoke the Portuguese uprising, he wasn't wrong that it was coming. His hope was that when it came, it would not coincide with a British intervention. To prevent just such a convergence, Junot had dispersed his divisions as ordered, but kept most forces near him in the capital in Lisbon, with only perhaps 2,000 troops stationed as guards for the military governors in the Portuguese regional capitals of Oporto, Faro, Évora, and Coimbra. In December 1807, the 3 Spanish divisions had occupied the regions promised to Spain. Francisco Taranco occupied Oporto, Francisco Solano, Évora, and Juan Carafa, the Tagus. The inciting incident for the Portuguese uprising occurred not in Portugal, but in Spain, as the Spanish juntas declared themselves in revolt. With communications through Spain severed, Junot found himself out of contact with Bayonne and without aid. Taranco, who had since died, was replaced by Domingo Ballesta, who on June 6th arrested General Quesnel, acting as military governor of Oporto. Oporto was handed over to its own junta, who, under the Bishop of Oporto, declared themselves in revolt. Word of the uprising rippled south, reaching Lisbon the next day. With the north of Portugal beyond reach, Junot determined to prevent Carafa from doing the same. In a string of coordinated strikes, the Spanish regiments were lured out of their cantonments and captured, with only a handful escaping, either to Oporto to join the Portuguese or to Badajoz to join the Seville junta. An unsuspecting Carafa was himself summoned before Junot and taken into custody. His 6,000 surrendered men were loaded into prisoner hulks in the port of Lisbon, where they would waste away for the next 2 months until paroled by the British. Solano, not needing a crystal ball to guess his fate, fled with his division to the safety of Seville. Junot's resolute dispatching of Carafa was not matched by his resolve regarding the wider Portuguese revolt. The south of the country was not in open revolt like the north, and so Junot intended to swiftly crush the Oporto junta to prevent the revolt metastasizing. What stopped him from acting was the prospect of leaving Lisbon underdefended, that and the possibility of a British landing, either launched from Britain itself or from Gibraltar. Cut off from France by land and by sea, Lisbon was now Junot's only source of ammunition, weapons, food and money, and the city was restless. Civil disturbances boiled over into increasingly worrisome acts of defiance, compelling Junot to deploy his troops to quell any potential uprising. Dragoons patrolled the streets, cannons loaded with grapeshot were stationed at bridges and in civic spaces. Tensions were high going into the Feast of the Corpus Christi on June 16th. Crammed into the plazas and streets outside the Lisbon Cathedral, the populace overwhelmed the French troops stationed there. Junot only narrowly avoided a bloodbath by striding into the crowd so that his men wouldn't fire. Disaster was averted, but Lisbon remained a powder keg begging for a spark. The pressing need to reinforce Lisbon led to Junot reaching out to Admiral Dmitry Sinavin, commander of the Russian Mediterranean fleet on its way back to the Baltic after the transfer of the Ionian Islands to France after the Treaty of Tilsit. This wasn't a journey that should have taken nearly a year since the signing of the peace. The slow pace was a combination of factors. On recommendation from Napoleon to Alexander, the Russians delayed transit of the Baltic until affairs in Denmark had resolved. A subsequent declaration of war between Britain and Russia then made the journey essentially impossible. But even before then, Sinavin was dragging anchor, hoping and expecting a return to hostilities with France before long. Indeed, this was why Sinavin had been neutral in Portugal since December 1807. He was loath to accept French offers of safe harbour at Toulon or Cadiz. Sinavin was unwilling to release his 7 warships or couple thousand sailors and marines to bolster Lisbon's garrison. If the British, whom Russia was hostile to, were to attack, Sinavin informed Junot he would be obliged to fight. But nothing could convince him to contribute anything to the pacification of Portugal, with whom the Russian government had no qualms. Despite the non-commitment of his troops, Sinavin still received food and ammunition from limited French stores, Junot proving to be the ally Sinavin was not. As Junot was negotiating with the Russians, watching for the British, and suppressing the Portuguese, his worst fears were made reality. On June 18th, the city of Faro raised the ensign of the Kingdom of Portugal. The French governor and several soldiers and aides were captured, though a Colonel Marassin evacuated the rest. He gathered a column of 1,200 French troops from across the south and retired to Lisbon. Before long, the entirety of the Algarve region was in rebel hands. The shock loss of the south of Portugal rocked Junot deeply. He believed he lacked the manpower to suppress a revolt from both north and south. Again, he fixated on the defense of Lisbon. Something had to be done though, so he sent the division of General Louis Loison marching off to Ciudad Rodrigo in Spain, where he was to make contact with Bessières, operating somewhere in León or Castile. Another division, under General Jean-Jacques Avril, was sent south to Guadiana to make contact with Dupont, who Junot assumed would be in Seville or nearby. Neither of these probes succeeded in re-establishing communications. Loison was menaced by forces of the León junta and forced to fall back to the fortress of Almeida. Avril learned of Dupont's predicament and pulled back to Estremoz, similarly threatened by a massing Spanish army at Badajoz. In light of all these failures, on June 25th, Junot resolved to withdraw all forces on Lisbon to defend at least the capital and the surrounding area. Recall orders were issued to all outlying divisions and garrisons, save for those at Elvas, Evora, and Peniche, which were to remain at strength. By now, the first outbursts of insurrection in central Portugal complicated the dispatch of orders. Couriers and riders were intercepted or forced to take circuitous routes. The retreating French garrisons then contended with armed partisan bands. In reprisal, most villages through which the French retired were torched, and the locals subjected to the horrors of a vengeful soldiery. Over the next few weeks, Junot used Lisbon as the launching pad for several pacification expeditions that repeated these horrors. Loison became particularly reviled for his grisly methods. When, in late July, Evora was surrounded by the Portuguese-Spanish army out of Badajoz, Loison led a reinforced division to its relief. He arrived too late to save the garrison, many of whom were killed as they fled from a coordinated citywide uprising, but he did arrive in time to catch the junta army in the field, pushing them back into the city. In revenge for 290 casualties, all 3,000 of the junta's soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, in addition to untold hundreds of civilians. Loison put Evora to a spiteful sack, sure to take the lion's share of the plunder for himself. News of the Portuguese and Spanish uprisings didn't take long to percolate back to Westminster. Spanish junta representatives arrived in early June, bearing the startling news that not only had large, coordinated regional revolts broken out against the French, but they seemed to be winning. Zaragoza, Valencia, and Girona held out, Dupont and Lecce were soon to be crushed, and insurgents plied their little war in the mountains and forests. Even in Portugal, the insurrection wanted only for weapons, not volunteers. For all the bad-mouthing of the Spanish and Portuguese arms before the war, very suddenly and very unexpectedly, the whole Iberian Peninsula was a raw, exposed nerve for the British to prod. For the interventionist Portland ministry, another opportunity to advance continental policy had come. Parliament briefly united to rush through the funding and supplies needed to outfit an expedition. The expeditionary forces, which had so recently returned from Denmark or were earmarked for it, were rested, refitted, and reinforced by new regiments. This process took several weeks, lasting from June well into August. Difficulties abounded. Horses and wagons were in short supply. Several regiments had to be retrained and the officers replaced. Logistical problems were solved with sheer effort. More contentious was the issue of command. There was no question for George Canning in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for the Duke of York, by now the de facto regent, and Horse Guards, that the reins of this wagon could only be placed in steady hands. Hugh Dalrymple and Harry Berard were proposed as the overall commanders of the expedition, the right mix of experienced and unimaginative. For a bit of vim and vigour, there would be a third in command, Sir John Moore, as a divisional commander. A tough, venerable veteran soldier of the campaigns in the Netherlands, Mediterranean, Caribbean, and North America, few names in the British Army were as well known. Except perhaps one. Upon returning from the Danish expedition, Arthur Wellesley was a rising star, earmarked for an expedition to Canada. Tensions with the United States were flaring, so several thousand troops were amassed at Cork to be sent overseas if war erupted. Wellesley had shooters in the War Office, Horse Guards, and chiefly in Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh, the Minister of War. Castlereagh had, for several years, sought out Wellesley's advice, appraising at once that he had a better grasp on strategy than any of his peers. Wellesley was also a proven battlefield commander to boot. Joining the army in 1787, he purchased his way up to major by 1793, and by age 26 was a lieutenant colonel of the 33rd Regiment of Foot. By way of connection to his brother, Robert Wellesley, Governor-General of India from 1799 to 1805, Wellesley fought in several actions of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, most famous among them Seringapatam. By 1802 he was a general and commanded British Indian forces against the Marathas Confederacy, scoring a decisive win at Essay. More recently, Wellesley had commanded a division in the Copenhagen expedition. He was the first to land and the first to fight, routing the Danish army at Kurga. Given his record, his backers, and his full personal support for continental intervention, Wellesley was a natural pick to lead the expedition, but could not match Dalrymple or Berard's powerful allies. Because Moore and his division were still in the Baltic, Wellesley would open operations, entrusted with landing the first brigades of British troops ahead of the main army. He departed on June 12th. The overall goal of the British campaign was pretty straightforward: liberate Portugal and eject Junot. Sailing ahead of the fleet, Wellesley conferred with the junta of Galicia at Corunna on July 20th. Their information was helpful, but coloured by the recent defeat at Medina de Rio Seco. They wanted Wellesley to land at Corunna so he joined the defence of that region. Not likely, but the detour was not a total waste of time. Through the junta, Wellesley learned where Junot's divisions were and the scale of the insurrection they faced. Rejoining the convoy, Wellesley made for the closest of these regional revolts in Oporto. There he conferred with representatives of their junta. Oporto confirmed Junot's dispositions, but that their own meagre forces, 5,000 partisans and levies under Bernardo Frere, had only scythes and picks and were far too weak to fight. More helpfully, Mondego Bay was noted as a perfect spot for a landing. It would at once draw pressure away from Oporto and place the British beachhead in a natural harbour. On August 1st, 1808, Wellesley made landfall in Portugal. Contrary winds and waves imperilled disembarkation. Several boats were overturned, spewing their contents, or their human and animal occupants, into the surging sea. The next unit to arrive was a small division under General Spencer out of Gibraltar on August 5th. Wellesley was making ready to advance when baggy sails of more British ships crested the horizon. It was the main convoy with the remaining 11,000 troops. They bore the distressing news that Brabant and Dalrymple would assume command the second they arrived, which was imminent. Much to his credit, Wellesley swallowed his pride and awaited his superiors. He attended to the myriad needs of the landed army. Thanks to cost-cutting from the War Office, supplies and horses were few and far between, so friendly contact was made with local Portuguese and fresh mounts brought in from Oporto. Only on the 13th were the British at full strength. 1st Brigade was led by General Major Rowland Hill. Hill's brigade consisted of the 5th, 9th and 38th Foot Regiments. Ronald Ferguson commanded the 2nd Brigade, made up of the 36th, 40th and 71st Foot Regiments. 3rd Brigade was led by Brigadier General Miles Nightingale. His brigade was composed of the 29th and 82nd Foot Regiments. Barnard Ford Bowes commanded 4th Regiment, made up of the 6th and 32nd Foot Regiments. 5th Brigade was led by Brigadier General Robert Crawford. Crawford's brigade consisted of the 45th, 50th and 91st Foot Regiments. The 6th Brigade was the Light Brigade, composed of the light infantry regiments of the 95th Rifles and the 60th Rifles. Command was held by Brigadier Henry Fane. We also have the Portuguese contingent under Colonel Nicholas Trant. There were no full-strength regiments, so instead infantry battalions were formed into a single ad hoc regiment, the same going for the cavalry regiment. Additionally, a battalion of Portuguese light infantry was available. So in all, the British had 15,000 troops organised into 7 brigades. Wellesley's plan was to cut east inland before plunging south towards Lisbon. Though it would have been agreeable to push north and secure Oporto, Wellesley judged that it was better to hit Junot early when he was still dispersed, rather than let him concentrate. Besides, Frere's army, even when equipped with British muskets and bayonets, stayed under Oporto's command. Only Trant's volunteers placed themselves under British control. Going south would also keep contact with the Royal Navy, which could resupply by sea and, in an emergency, conduct an evacuation. The British army reached Leiria on the 13th and then Albawassa on the 14th. Delabelle's division was in the vicinity, having been sent north to suppress the Porto uprising. Now his mission had changed to containing the British expedition. Delabelle intended to make a stand at Albawassa, but his scouts reported that not only were the British forces much larger and better equipped, they were marching hard to the south. Having left behind his 2nd Brigade in Lisbon, Delabelle had, being generous, a composite force of between 4,000 and 5,000 troops. Only the 4th Swiss Line Regiment was out in full strength, though it was stiffened by several battalions of light infantry, drawn from the 10th, 4th and 26th Light Regiments. Additionally, he had a 4-strong battery of horse-drawn artillery and a company of chasseurs à cheval. Delaborde abandoned Alcabasa only a few hours ahead of Wellesley, pulling his division about 40 kilometers south to Roliça, with a small rearguard at Obidos. Here the ground was much better for the defence. Roliça was situated in a sandy basin split by crossroads. From the northern approach towards Obidos, the road was covered by a small hill that surveyed the roadways and the open fields to the west. Terrain to the east, over a weak stream, was rugged, with long slopes and high overlooks. To the south lay the village of Colombera, about 2 kilometers from Roliça. It lay at the base of narrow and steep defiles leading to a plateau on which the village of Zambogueira was sited. The defiles at the side of the plateau, especially those facing Colombera's olive groves, were rugged and treacherous, covered by thick, prickly vegetation. Delaborde was well aware that his numerically inferior force could not hope to hold back the British, but he might be able to inflict disproportionate losses in the narrow gullies that offered the only way for infantry to scramble up the heights. Otherwise, by clever concealment, Delaborde might hope to snatch a minor strategic victory by fooling his inexperienced enemy into overestimating French numbers and withdrawing. Once the British committed to an attack on Roliça, Delaborde planned for a tactical retreat to the highlands of Colombera. He didn't have to wait long to put this plan into action. The first sign of the British advance were plumes of dust and smoke emanating from Obidos on the afternoon of August 15th. Elements from the 95th and 60th Rifles engaged and were initially repulsed by a small French rearguard, until relieved by Spencer's division. Throughout the night, the British amassed. When on the 17th the last stragglers had caught up, Wellesley ordered an attack. The plan was simple: to turn Delaborde's flanks and pincer him left and right. With a clear view of the plains and farmland, Delaborde watched as the brigades of Hill, Nightingale and Crawford marched in columns across the fields towards Roliça. On their western flank swept Trant's Portuguese contingent. Delaborde presumed that a flanking motion was at hand, probably to be delivered by Trant. Fire from 12 British 6-pounders seemed to confirm these suspicions. As Delaborde's tirailleurs began to skirmish with the leading edge of the British advance, the real flanking force, Ferguson and Bowes brigades, supported by Fane's rifles, swept down the hillsides from the east. Delaborde issued the withdrawal order. Expertly screened by light infantry, the French division pulled back to take up the mantle along Colombera. Casualties so far had been light, a few dozen on both sides. Though maintaining good order, the British advance was ponderously slow. Delaborde had plenty of time to withdraw, afforded even more as Wellesley redressed his lines at Roliça and established a battery near the village windmills. In that time, the 70e Line Regiment arrived from Lisbon, taking up position on the French right. Wellesley's unmodified plan of attack was repeated that afternoon, Colombera the focus this time. Ferguson and Trent continued their flanking manoeuvres, but encountered adverse terrain, as well as detached companies from the 70e Regiment. Neither commander was in a position to support Hill, Fane and Crawford's brigades as they made a frontal assault on Delaborde from Colombera. In the orange twilight the action was fierce. The 29th Foot of Nightingale's brigade scrambled up a gully on Delaborde's left, spurred on by Colonel George Lake. As the 29th crested the hill, they sustained withering fire from surrounding French units. Relief seemed at hand as the 29th's troopers formed a ragged firing line on the French ambushes, only to then themselves be repulsed with a ferocious charge by the Swiss. Colonel Lake was killed along with a few dozen troopers as the 29th tumbled back down the hillside in disarray. Elsewhere, Fane and Crawford fared just as poorly. British troopers, supported by the rifles, could penetrate up the gullies but could not come to grips with the embedded French infantry, concealed in thick bushes. Attack after attack was launched. The British repulsed, reformed, and then recommitted. Delaborde was on the cusp of achieving his desired strategic win when reports arrived from his extreme right flank. After hours of stoic fighting and a delaying action, the flank guards of the 70e Regiment had finally run out of ammunition and been forced back. Ferguson was now threatening the escape route south. For the second time that day, Delaborde issued withdrawal orders. Complicated by the closeness of the British and the roughness of the terrain, the French withdrawal was chaotic. All of the artillery had to be abandoned, and the French were now hemmed in by the same narrow gullies which had proven so defensible in previous hours. Nightfall was a welcome respite, and under the cover of darkness the French escaped largely intact to Zamboanga. Though falling short of his best-case scenario, Delaborde had acquitted himself admirably, delaying the British for a day and inflicting disproportionate losses. Wellesley could likewise be proud of his troops. On debut, they'd been vetted under the most trying of circumstances, in frontal attacks against capable foes. Casualties for both sides were light throughout most of the day. Only at Columbera did losses mount. The Swiss 4th Regiment mostly disintegrated, accounting for most of the 600 French losses, though most were not dead or wounded, but in fact deserted. The 29th Foot was not annihilated, but its colonel was dead along with 200 rank and file, accounting in turn for half of the British losses. The true upside of the Battle of Roliça was to grant Junot the time he needed to scramble a defence. Delaborde's action provided the first definitive reports of the scale of the British expedition. Left unchecked, Lisbon would soon be imperilled and Portugal lost. Junot therefore resolved to meet the British in the field as soon as possible. Reserve infantry and cavalry were gathered, along with the artillery park and ammunition wagons. Final entreaties that St. might garrison Lisbon also came to naught, forcing Junot to allocate General Kellerman's cavalry and a significant number of reserve infantry to form a 6,500-strong garrison of Lisbon. On August 15th, Junot departed, collecting Trevor's division on the way and arriving at Cercal, about 30 kilometres southeast of Roliça, on August 16th. Scouts were sent ahead to find out what had happened to Delaborde and where the British were. Delaborde justifiably was falling back on Lisbon, under the impression Junot was still there with the main force. Wellesley, meanwhile, had not pursued, but instead marched to the ocean-facing town of Vimiero to rendezvous with reinforcements by sea. Exhausted and hobbled by the heavy convoys, Junot retraced his steps back to Lisbon and ordered all available forces to converge on the Torres Vedras. By August 20th, most of what was available had arrived. All three divisions were badly under strength as they were forced to part with entire regiments for the garrisons of Lisbon, Evora, Almeida, and on the Tagus River forts. In all, Junot had 10,000 infantry organised into three divisions, led by Delaborde, Loison, and Travaux, with Junot himself commanding a reserve, a hodgepodge of ammunition wagons and provisional grenadier battalions. The cavalry division of 2,000 sables was commanded by General Pierre Margeron. The artillery park boasted 24 guns. Against Junot was Wellesley's force, same as it had been at Roliça, but now reinforced by two brigades under Generals Ackland and Ansruther, totalling 4,000 infantry. As these two brigades were debouching at the natural harbour of Porto Novo, Wellesley entrenched a little inland to protect the approaches from the east and south. The position was perfect. A stone's throw from the mouth of the Macera River was the prosperous agricultural town of Vimiero. It lay at the crossroads of the coastal road. Going south led to Lisbon, east to Torres Vedras. Rising up on the flanks of Vimiero were two wide hilly ridges. The northernmost ridge was heavily forested and crisscrossed by steep ravines and cliffsides. The southern ridge was not as tall, but just as unassailably steep. Before both, in the valley surrounding Vimiero, vineyards and farmlands teemed with activity. Wellesley anticipated an attack, if any was to materialise, to come from the direction of Lisbon, and so set up his defence in a 3-mile-wide crescent oriented south. Occupying the southern ridge was Hill's brigade and a battery of 6 guns. Stretching out across the northern ridge were the brigades of Bowes, Crawford and Nightingale. Ferguson, Trant and the small brigade of 500 Portuguese and British cavalry remained in reserve at the village of Macera. In the town of Vimiero itself was stationed Ansruther's hastily assembled brigade, supported by Fane's light infantry and 6 guns on the large hill to its southeast. Overall, Wellesley's position was near perfect for defence. His brigades easily covered the likely approaches, were amassed in depth, and occupied advantageous high ground. But if Wellesley had things his way, the British army would never have occupied the ground at all. In the wake of Ansruther and Ackland's convoys arrived the two commanding generals, Barrard and Darmapul. Barrard arrived first on August 20th. Wellesley met him aboard his ship, where the good general, tired after such a long journey, opted to stay aboard for a calm night's rest, intending to take command in the morning. It meant that in the meantime, Wellesley's plan to march on Lisbon was nixed. All offensive action was to be halted for the foreseeable future until the division of John Moore arrived. Moore was close, but still days away. To miss the chance to strike another blow at the French incensed Wellesley, but orders were orders, and he followed them to the letter. Returning to Vimiero, he redressed the lines and ordered earthworks dug. Scouts from Kellerman's brigade were the first French troops on scene, arriving on August 20th. There was little action as the French dragoons and British rifle pickets stared each other down intently. Junot received fairly accurate reports of Wellesley's strength and dispositions. A frontal attack was out of the question. Any French attack would be torn apart on the approaches to Vimiero in an assault on the ridgelines. Instead, he opted for a wide flanking manoeuvre far to the north. While half the corps contested Hill and Andsreuth at Vimiero, the rest would swing north to threaten the British left by occupying Ventosa. This village was on the northern ridgeline, and by occupying it, Junot expected that he could throw the British line into disorder, if not outflank it entirely. After a long night march, Junot's corps arrived on scene in early morning. After resting for a few hours, the divisions fanned out to their assigned positions. Facing Vimiero was Loison on the French left, de Laborde to his right, both supported by Majoron's cavalry regiments. A flanking force was split off, composed of a brigade under Solignac and another under Brenier. Supported by the Dragoon Regiment, they marched north to occupy Toledo village. In reserve was Kellerman's Grenadier Reserve and two ad hoc Grenadier regiments under Marassin and Saint-Clair. It took until 9 a.m. for most of the French divisions to be in position. There they stayed in battle order, assailed by the beating sun, for several more hours. Wellesley was, at first, taken aback by Junot's dispositions. An attack on Vimiero was predictable, but on Ventosa less so. Ferguson was immediately ordered forward to plug the gap. Seeing the movements of Ferguson's brigade from a rolling plume of dust, Junot ordered de Laborde and Loison to attack Vimiero Hill without delay. 11 cannons opened up from the flanks of the hill, while 7 were sent in as part of an assaulting wave of tirailleurs and line infantry from Charlot's brigade of 2 line regiments. The British rifle companies holding the vineyards and farmhouses yielded ground, retiring back up the hill, and in so doing drawing Charlot deeper in. Nearing the apex, the rifles evaporated, revealing a crisp red line of Andsreuth's infantry. Delivering a punishing fusillade, backed by their 6 cannon, the British pulverized Charlot's regiments. As they fell back, the British line infantry charged, sending the French tumbling back down the hillside, leaving their cannon to be captured. Though the first French attack was repulsed, Andsreuth and Fane's lines had been disrupted. In the window of opportunity afforded, Junot issued forth with a second attack by the Grenadiers of Saint-Clair's reserve, supported by Charlot's rallied regiments. Again, the attack faltered against the dug-in British troopers and riflemen, barely making it halfway up the hillside. It was now approaching midday, and Junot had failed to force the British to budge so much as an inch. He ordered a final, all-or-nothing attack. Kellerman and the last of the Grenadier Reserve drove on a flanking attack to the north of Vimiero Hill, intending to get behind it and into the town. As they went, fire poured in on them from the northern ridgeline. The way forward too was blocked as a rump of Ackland's brigade, barely off the boats, formed an ad hoc line to prevent a breakthrough. Kellerman's momentum was blunted, but he did at least occupy some of the houses and buildings of the town. Here he held for a few hours until Andsreuth called upon the 43rd Regiment of Foot from his uncommitted reserves. Supported by the rifles, the 43rd flanked Kellerman through a cemetery and fell upon his flank. Fierce house-to-house fighting ensued for the next few hours until Kellerman ordered a withdrawal. Witnessing Kellerman's collapse, Junot knew the jig was up and the battle lost, at least in the south. He ordered a retreat. Majoron's cavalry rode into the developing breach between the French and British lines, ably warding off any potential counterattack by the infantry. But they were too few to prevent the breakthrough of the British 20th Hussars, Numbering only around 250 men, the squadron flanked the French and fell in amongst the fleeing infantry. Initially, they'd been joined by the Portuguese, but after the first of them had been felled by musket fire, the rest fled. The 20th Hussars cut their way nearly to Junot. Only a well-struck countercharge by the French 5e Dragoons averted total catastrophe, rescuing Junot and killing Colonel Taylor of the 20th Hussars with a shot to the heart. By late afternoon, the French were pressed to the eastern roads, scrambling to escape a feared British pursuit. 2 miles to the north, Brenier and Solignac managed to make their attacks on Ventosa, but only after Junot had ordered the retreat. Brenier struggled on the rough road leading north of Toledo, while Solignac ploughed a direct path overland. Supported by artillery and cavalry, he pushed aside a small line of skirmishers, and expected to find the small village mostly deserted. Ferguson's arrayed regiments put paid to that idea. Solignac's regiments managed to secure a sliver of the high ground, enough to mount their artillery, but under cascading volley fire from Ferguson. After just a handful of these devastating volleys, Solignac's brigade was in disarray. Their now wounded commander ordered a retreat north to the succour of Brenier, but none could make it that far. Clinging to their diminishing run of ridgeline, Solignac's men were in short order surrounded and set to be overrun. Witnessing the plight of Solignac, Brenier rushed to his comrades' aid. Supported by the Dragoon Regiment and cannon fire, they managed to drive Ferguson back from Ventosa with a brilliant charge, which blunted the momentum of 2 regiments of British infantry. But despite his brave efforts, Brenier's charge was not enough. Solignac's brigade failed to rally and recommit, leaving Brenier vulnerable as he was countercharged. He ordered a withdrawal to Ventosa, covered by the Dragoon Regiment. The Dragoons fought doggedly, bravely in the defence, and did manage to cover the withdrawal, but they in turn were annihilated as Ferguson advanced with fiery intent. As night fell, both the brutalised French brigades made good their retreat. It was an extremely close escape. Totally exposed on the northern flank and horrifically outnumbered, had there been but a few more hours of daylight, the British would assuredly have destroyed, or more probably captured, the 2 brigades. In the event, no British pursuit was forthcoming. It was not for lack of willingness, for though the cavalry force was expended, the uncommitted brigades of Hill, Crawford, Trant and Nightingale were rearing to go. Wellesley was making preparations for them to pursue, when up from the coast strode a well-rested General Berard. He countermanded any pursuit on the grounds that the French infantry were bested, but their cavalry still roamed free, and that Vimiero must be held until Moore's arrival. Berard even ordered Ferguson, on the cusp of overrunning Solignac and Brenier at Ventosa, to draw up stakes for the night. Wellesley was, as you might expect, pretty ropeable, but his arguments amounted to nothing. He had to be content with another battle won at paltry cost, 131 killed and 497 wounded. Still, as Wellesley yielded command to Berard, there was the bitter taste of disappointment in his mouth. Junot was thus afforded the respite needed to retire to Lisbon. His losses were heavy. Of his 12,000 engaged troops, 2,000 were casualties, concentrated almost entirely among the infantry regiments. In the south, the 32e and the 90e regiments, both from Chaubrun's brigade, had seen about 200 killed and wounded in their initial attack. Kellermann's grenadiers suffered about half as many. Bad as these were, most of the French losses were concentrated in the north. Solignac's brigade was all but wiped out, as was the Dragoon Regiment, accounting for most of the 1,600 French prisoners taken by the British. Officer casualties were unusually severe, a common feature of battles featuring botched or stalled attacks. De Laborde, Loison and Solignac were all wounded. The 2 artillery colonels on scene, Foy and Prost, were also hurt. 2 généraux de brigade, Brenier and Jean Toussaint à Régie, were captured as the northern attack faltered. Junot himself had only narrowly evaded harm, coming under direct fire whilst exposed on the plains, owing credit to a stone wall and the sudden death of their colonel for his close escape from the British Hussars. Criticism can be heaped on Junot, and certainly has been. The northern flank was overly ambitious and too wide to be kept in close contact, leaving them exposed. Coordination on the Vimiero attacks was deplorable, and the plan to attack an entrenched and superior enemy with insufficient forces in the first place was probably a bad idea. But under the circumstances, Junot had done what he could, try to prevent a British consolidation after the landing. What he truly deserves criticism for comes next. Junot retreated his army to Torres Vedras, not Lisbon, thereby exposing the road leading to the capital. In due course, Lisbon was in uproar. Its 5,000-strong garrison, reduced from 6,500 by Kellermann's reinforcements to Junot, unable to contain the scale of the uprising. On August 22nd, Dalrymple arrived in the British camp and managed to talk some sense into Barrard, who did consent to an advance in the next few days. Wellesley wanted to drive to Lisbon, Barrard and Dalrymple on the Torres Vedras. Junot knew from captured British prisoners that reinforcements were expected. He could not count on the delay caused by Barrard. In a council of war with all senior commanders, Junot assessed options. All were equally abysmal. Firstly, to try somehow to march through hostile country and outpace the British, to arrive in Lisbon, whereupon he would be bottled up in a peninsula and besieged in a hostile city. Second, he could try and rally to recommit to another battle at Torres Vedras, Mafra or Montachique to check the British. Thirdly, he could retreat to Elvas and from there into Spain, leaving the French garrisons in Portugal to their fate. The last option was the most seriously considered, but ran aground against the same basic problem as the first two. The French army of Portugal was simply too demoralised to continue. Any orders, save a complete retreat, might see the army simply refuse and disintegrate. As it was, Junot was having a hard time keeping order, as his undisciplined troops avenged their defeat on hapless Portuguese villagers. Rather than risk it all for a doomed cause, Junot, with the assent of his senior officers, opted for a fourth option, to do the until now unthinkable, to seek terms and capitulate. Kellermann presented himself at the British camp at Vimiero around 2 p.m, offering capitulation. Wellesley was present at negotiations, but sidelined as Dalrymple and Barrard enthusiastically endorsed the proposal, eager as they were to avoid another battle, even if they were sure to win. Neither offered much resistance as Kellermann ran circles around them. Known for his quick wit, Kellermann's selection as negotiator was deliberate. An imperious commander and son of Louvanquier de Vimy, he could be relied upon not to dishonour the army, a central concern for the French commanders. Unlike his superiors, Wellesley, it should be noted, was a match for Kellermann, and for his own reasons approved the crucial measure of a French surrender, mostly because it would spare Lisbon from destruction and hasten the end of the French occupation. Over dinner, the terms of a 2-day armistice were agreed. The Brits ceased their advance a mere 9 miles out of Vimiero, and the French withdrew from Torres Vedras. Details for the final peace were discussed at length over the preceding 7 days. While the French and British generals were aligned, Portuguese General Frere protested, with more bark than bite, to Portugal being excluded from a pact that fundamentally concerned their own country. The Royal Navy proved obstinate too, as they wanted to take intact the Russian fleet, something Junot was not at liberty to offer. The Navy's assent was required, as it was their ship Junot hoped to hitch a ride home aboard. In the end, the poor relations between Sinalvin and Junot proved a boon, as the Navy dropped their objections once the Russians entered into separate negotiations. Good sense prevailed as the 22-article-long Convention of Cintra was signed on August 30th, 1808, at Torres Vedras, mind, not Cintra. The French agreed to a complete withdrawal and disinvestment from Portugal, its cities, fortresses and assets left intact. All debts would be discharged, all monies relinquished, and all prisoners, namely Carafa's Spanish division, released. In exchange, the Royal Navy would ferry the French army, 26,000 in all, to French Atlantic ports. Kellermann had screwed the British down to an agreement over 3 articles that permitted the French to take with them, quote, property of the army. In principle, this only covered things like horses, weapons and ammunition, but in practice, as Kellermann intended, army property was taken to include all booty, loot and paraphernalia stolen from the Portuguese, which could be carried on as personal effects. For most of the French officers, this was an affront, as their loot was bulky and carried by wagons. Several, especially the rapacious Loison, refused to evacuate unless they were allowed to take along everything they'd plundered. Junot surrendered his bulky items, but smuggled several priceless manuscripts and small artworks back to France in the custody of his personal aide, Le Grave, who was also bearing a message informing Napoleon of the Convention of Cintra. After this swindle, the British were onto him and thwarted an attempt to wring 25,000 francs worth of paper currency out of the Portuguese judicial treasury. Every other senior officer tried and mostly failed to protect their hoards. Among the surrendered property were artworks, gold bars, silverware, fine wines, and fancy dresses, but most scandalously of all, church valuables from far and wide. No wonder then the Portuguese people took matters into their own hands. Though Junot's main force got away scot-free, embarking on September 13th, regional garrisons were not so lucky. The garrison of Almeida was escorted by 200 British troops through a baying mob of Portuguese. Much of the French baggage had to be abandoned after the men were aboard, as the British struggled to contain the mob. A bloodbath might have ensued had the ships not weighed anchor. In Lisbon, the garrison was assailed night and day in the 2 weeks it took for the Royal Navy to pick them up, with several soldiers lynched. Similar scenes played out in Elvas. Though all French citizens were protected by the Convention of Cintra, there was no enforcement outside of the areas of direct British supervision. Again, lynchings and revenge killings were reported. This extended to officials who had willingly served the French. Only by the end of September had the evacuation been completed. Minus 2 transports lost at sea with all souls, the entire French army of Portugal was returned safely home to La Rochelle and Lorient. Reactions to the Convention of Cintra from their home governments were, as you might predict, not positive. In Britain, the reaction was bafflement, followed by recrimination. I won't go over the details, but needless to say, after a scathing inquiry, Dalrymple and Barrard were removed from command and put behind desks, making way for Wellesley's elevation. In France, the only reaction that mattered was Napoleon's. The first he heard of Cintra was from Le Grave. Details flowed from both Fouché's agents and British tabloids. The Convention of Cintra was a slap in the face for French prestige, but Napoleon was able to take solace in the fact that the army was largely intact, as he made clear to Minister of War Clark. Quote, "As soon as Junot or other officers of his army disembark, you will write to them that I have learned of the agreement, that I do not know whether I should approve it, but pending the report I am to receive, I see nothing in this act that is contrary to honour. Since the troops have not laid down their arms, they are returning with their flags, they are not prisoners, and they are arriving not through a capitulation, but through an agreement that is more political than military. I expect from Junot an account of all the events, which will inform me what prevented him, having seen this coming for 6 weeks, from establishing a fortified central location. This is what the art of war dictated he should have done in such a situation." Indeed, Junot had lost only about 4,000 of roughly 30,000 troops in his corps during the expedition, returning the rest alive and in decent order, their weapons and property in hand. Without delay, all were to be put straight back into action after a brief period of recuperation. As compared to Milan, fought a month earlier than Vimiero, Junot had salvaged a tolerable loss out of a total defeat. Nonetheless, Napoleon did have some choice words for Junot. Quote, "To the Duc d'Abrant, the Minister of War has shown me all your reports, and in particular your letter of the 15th of October. You have done nothing that is dishonourable. You have brought me back my soldiers, my standards, my guns. I had, however, hoped that you would fare better. From the very first moments of your entry into Portugal, I warned you of the necessity of controlling the Portuguese, of having no confidence in them, and of establishing a reinforced position. You earned this agreement through your courage, but not through your positioning, and it is with good reason that the English complained that their generals signed it. You would have earned it if you had signed it in an entrenched camp 6 weeks later. Today I have publicly approved your conduct. What I am writing confidentially is for you alone." Also in the letter, Napoleon gave specific criticisms, largely centred on Junot's fixation on Lisbon, missing the grander point that even if lost, the French were positioned to send reinforcements. Napoleon claimed that he could have relieved Junot by December, but even in the worst-case scenario, a siege of Lisbon or Evora would have tied down large numbers of British and Portuguese troops. It was all academic now, and clearly Napoleon didn't begrudge his one-time favourite too harshly. Junot's hopes of elevation to the ranks of the marshals were quashed, but he remained a corps commander, living to fight another day. There was no question, though, that Portugal was irretrievably lost to France, and it seemed Spain was not far behind. With the way to Madrid cleared by Bessieres' victory on the Rio Seco, King Joseph had been able to make his way to the new royal capital. He'd arrived at Bayonne on June 9th, and a month later was crossing the Pyrenees into Spain, escorted by 450 cavalrymen. Napoleon followed him across the border, imparting a final assurance to, quote, "Never doubt your complete success." Joseph reached Burgos a few days later, finding on the way every reason to doubt his brother's conviction. The trip was untroubled by partisans or bad weather, but the pueblos were, as was now the norm, abandoned. Towns through which the royal procession passed were eerily quiet, their residents hidden, casting aspersions and furtive glances through slitted windows. Only mayors and local magistrates, under threat of arrest, could be induced to offer a hollow welcome. Madrid was no different. When Joseph entered the capital, he was welcomed only by Murat's military bands and parading troops. They were only modest crowds and a bundle of ministers or officials. It was spooky. For all the pomp, this was an ominous beginning to Joseph's reign. Sensitive to public opinion, he brooded about his Spanish assignment. On July 19th, he received a letter from Napoleon, again attempting to allay these fears. Quote, "You must not find it too extraordinary to conquer your kingdom. Philippe V and Henri IV had been obliged to conquer theirs. Be cheerful. Do not let this point affect you. And do not doubt for an instant that things will be better and more promptly than you think." Joseph was installed in the royal palace, accompanied by the dozens of members of his household. Among them were several of the afrancesados who travelled to Bayonne and hoped to staff the new government ministries. Urquijo became Secretary of State, Cevallos Minister of Foreign Affairs, O'Farrell Prime Minister, Azanza the Minister of Finance, Pinuela Minister of War, Mazzaredo Minister of the Marine. Charles Saligny, a chef d'etat of the Army of Naples, and one of Joseph's favourites, accompanied him too as an advisor. Of course, Napoleon's appointed Lieutenant of Spain, Joachim Murat, and his co-viceroy, Anne-Marie Savary, would command a high degree of influence in Joseph's court. But it was Joseph's court, and he was free to pick and choose ministers, enact policies, and conduct reforms. Not that he got the chance. Joseph had barely unpacked his bags before the first trickles of information about the Convention of Bayonne reached the capital. Dupont's disaster left the roads to Madrid wide open to Castanos' army. 4 days after arriving, a council of war was convened to discuss evacuation. Murat, still ill, abdicated to Savary, who counselled amassing all available forces at Madrid for the defence. He was a lonely voice. None of the Spanish ministers or French generals agreed with the plan, instead advocating a precipitous evacuation. Joseph conveyed this decision and preliminary assessments of Bayonne to Napoleon. He responded on July 31st. Quote, "Mon frère, I received your letters. I do not like this style of your letter on the 24th. It is not a question of dying, but of living and being victorious. I will find the pillars of Hercules in Spain, but not the limits of my power. Since I have been in service, the most cowardly thing I have found is the Spanish troops. Moreover, troops and reinforcements of every kind are heading your way. You have a third more forces than you need, if they are directed with the proper precision." Savary is a man of both intellect and heart, who erred in his general approach because he is not accustomed to commanding in chief, but who, nevertheless, is still stronger than those around you. Your position may be difficult as king, but it is brilliant as a general. There is only one thing to fear. Beware of losing the morale of the army and sacrificing it to the Spanish. Dupont must be supported. Rest assured about the outcome of all of this. I know your position well. Nothing that has happened has surprised me. Would I otherwise have sent 150,000 men to Spain, levied 2 classes of conscripts, and spent 80 million francs? Napoleon's declaration that he would find not the limits of his power in Spain, but instead stand astride it to reach the Pillars of Hercules at the Straits of Gibraltar, rang hollow only days after this letter was sent, when he learned of the full extent of the capitulations of Bayonne. In the midst of an apparently looming disaster, Joseph made good his escape. Remaining French forces withdrew over the next few weeks to a line roughly along the river Ebro, securing at least their handhold in the north. Major forts and defensible cities at San Sebastian, Tudela, Burgos and Pamplona meant the French weren't ejected entirely from Spain, but the Spanish had free rein to reclaim most of the territory lost since March. Thus, the first phase of Napoleon's Iberian campaign fell more than a few steps short of the Pillars of Hercules. Rather than crush Spain and Portugal, both were armed and arrayed against France. Britain had successfully conjoined with the newfound allies, and France was now embroiled in tough campaigning against capable foes who'd inflicted heavy losses on the deployed corps. There was no other way to swing it. The campaign so far had been a dismal failure. The Iberian imbroglio had consequences extending well beyond Spanish borders. As word of the French defeats and the subsequent retreat to the Ebro spread throughout Europe, France's diplomatic position took a nasty blow. Though at the start of 1808 Napoleon's empire looked unassailable, a Spanish quagmire hinted at opportunity for his enemies. Both Prussia and Austria would, as we'll cover soon, work to undermine the French Empire in Germany. But more pressing in the short term, and certainly what concerned Napoleon the most, was how the capitulations of by land and Cintra would land in St. Petersburg, and so we turn now to Franco-Russian relations. It's been about a year since the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807, and in that time, relations between France and Russia deteriorated at the intersection of overlapping spheres of influence and territorial ambition. The causes are multivalent and mutual, complicated further by simultaneous flashpoints in the Baltic, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans. Passing out why relations fared so poorly takes us back to the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit. As per its clauses, both public and secret, the French and Russian spheres of influence in Europe were defined. Going from north to south, the Baltics were to join the continental system, with Finland to be conquered by Russia. Everything west of the Elbe was French, everything east Russian, with the exception of Poland and Danzig, both coming under French dominion. Prussia and Austria were neutral, and the Balkans were to be divided, the specifics not yet decided, but again roughly apportioned half and half, with the Adriatic facing west to France and the rest to Russia. Diplomatically, Napoleon agreed to abandon his support for the Ottoman Empire and back Russia's annexation of the disputed principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Reciprocating, the Russians promised to declare war on Britain if they made no peace with France, while Napoleon promised he would pressure the Ottomans to accede to Russian demands within 3 months of the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit, or else he would declare war in support of Russia. This was the Treaty of Tilsit as it stood in July 1807. Neither Napoleon nor Alexander were so naive as to think circumstances wouldn't change, especially with the situation so fluid in the Baltic and Balkans. Further negotiations would be essential, so an exchange of diplomats was ordered. Napoleon would eventually appoint Armand Augustin Caulaincourt as his ambassador to St. Petersburg, but in the short term sent the trusted aide, Anne-Marie Savary, on temporary assignment as envoy. Quote, "You will go to St. Petersburg," Napoleon wrote to Savary on June 13, 1807, still in the midst of negotiations at Tilsit. "Inform me of what you have learned about the events of the campaign, the factions dividing the court, and any personnel changes that may occur in the ministries." The Russians were not so nimble. Nikolai Romantsev, the Russian foreign minister, was personally pro-French and proudly anti-British, but found several high-ranking members in government and among the Romanov family wary, if not outright hostile, to closer entanglement with France. It wouldn't be until October 15th that Pyotr Tolstoy, Russian ambassador to Paris, would reach France. This created in the meantime a situation of one-way communication, in which Napoleon's only way to gain Russian intentions was either through his envoy Savary or by correspondence with Emperor Alexander. By contrast, Savary was ordered to give prompt and courteous service to his Russian hosts, and Napoleon frequently sent detailed letters to Alexander. With all that out of the way, we have the necessary context for Franco-Russian relations as they stood in 1807, a combination of miscommunication and a dynamic European situation. Flashpoints in the Baltic, Balkans, and Eastern Europe would exacerbate these issues. The first major flashpoint occurred simultaneously with the Treaty of Tilsit, the second bombardment of Copenhagen. We've already gone over the details. What's important is how Napoleon figured Russia would factor in. Russia had a long-standing interest in keeping Denmark friendly, or at least neutral, so that Russian trade could transit the Baltic. Dynastic ties and guarantees formalized this relationship. Britain's surprise attack drove Denmark, as we've seen, into the French camp, and generated bundles of diplomatic hay for Napoleon. Never one to leave an opening unexploited, he proposed to Alexander a joint strategy, where France and Russia would pressure neutral European courts to expel British embassies and join the continental system. Quote, "My dear brother, I wrote to your Majesty a few days ago concerning the affairs of Copenhagen. At this moment, I have received letters dated August 21st, informing me that the city is under formal siege. I feel great indignation at this horrific act, and have a strong desire to make the English government repent. It seems to me that what should be done first is to force Sweden to declare itself against England, then to compel Austria to expel the English minister from Vienna, and to close the port of Trieste to England. If your Majesty shares these sentiments, it will only be a matter of sending instructions to your minister in Vienna, and then our two ambassadors will jointly request a conference with the Austrian foreign minister and strive to persuade him that it is in the interest of all powers to have no communications with a power that tramples underfoot what is most sacred among men. If, after a few conferences, the Viennese court remains recalcitrant, our ambassadors will declare that they have orders to leave Vienna if, within a specified time, the English minister has not himself left that residence. I suppose that Austria will not expose itself to a combined war from our two states. If she did that, she would soon have reason to regret it." Though Alexander was supportive of inflicting diplomatic pain on Britain, the exact mechanisms were evidently to Napoleon's direct advantage, and quite possibly a detriment to Russia. As regarded Austria, he was proposing Russia expend valuable political capital to compel them to join the continental system and commit to war if they didn't. The commitment regarding Sweden was even more unpalatable, since it was interpreted as Napoleon going back on his word. At Tilsit, he'd signalled his assent to see Russia conquer Finland, a constituent part of the Kingdom of Sweden. The benefits for Russia were mainly to secure large timber and fur sources and to protect St. Petersburg. Here was Napoleon proposing Sweden join the continental system and thereby the French sphere. Russia's taking Finland was an afterthought. Only if Sweden refused would Napoleon support the conquest of Finland. King of Sweden, Gustav IV, despised both the French and the Russians, and was a long-standing ally of Britain. He would not permit the dismemberment of his kingdom. Besides, if war broke out, he was promised a British expeditionary force and subsidies. To sweeten the pot, Canning offered Dutch colonies and the long-coveted Kingdom of Norway if Sweden successfully occupied Sjælland. Through Savary, Napoleon asked Alexander to throw his weight around. Quote, "The English must be expelled from Sweden. Only Russia can accomplish this. Therefore, urge Emperor Alexander to speak firmly to Sweden and ensure he is obeyed. Then the entire operation in the Baltic will become easy. The English may not wait for this moment. Their expulsion from the continent, by striking their industry with a mortal blow, will finally make them desire peace. At present, they disdain it. Their response to Emperor Alexander's overtures is clearly a refusal, especially when explained by their measure against Denmark, taken at the same time. Thus, the same hand signed both this evasive reply and the order to burn Copenhagen. The English ministry was making it quite clear they still wanted the risk of war. Good to his word, Alexander did declare war on Britain on September 2nd, citing the bombardment of Copenhagen. Just prior, as Ambassador Maximilien Aloysius was departing, he was informed that Canning was prepared to negotiate a peace with France. Canning expected that the shock proposal would compel Alexander to normalise relations and return to mediation. If he did not, Britain threatened to withdraw from continental affairs. French pressure and the fallout from Copenhagen made it impossible for Alexander to accept Canning's last-minute proposal. As Russian and British vessels jostled in the Baltic and North Seas, negotiations with Sweden dragged on. A faction of high-ranking nobles and army officers feared no amount of British support would avail Sweden, a prediction that proved correct. They instead wished to revive their traditional alliance with France, which had existed in one form or another since the 1620s and lasted until the French Revolution. By joining the continental system, they might be able to retain Finland. In the event, the work of these disaffected nobles only served to exacerbate the vacillations of an indecisive Gustav. The decision was made for him in February 1808, when the Russo-Swedish War began with a well-planned land invasion along the Finnish coast and Karelian interior. Britain supported Sweden the best they could. John Moore had taken command of British expeditionary forces remaining in the Baltic after the attack on Copenhagen. These troops were offered by the British government to Sweden. Moore wasn't keen on the idea, but followed orders and anchored his 12,000 troops at Göteborg on the Swedish western Baltic coast, while he himself went to Stockholm to discuss the specifics of British involvement. King Gustav expected that Moore's force would be placed under direct Swedish command, whereupon it would fight directly the Russians in Finland. The goal was shocking. Gustav was demanding the British risk 2 divisions against an enemy they were not at all set on fighting, and that was on top of the British squadron already assisting in the Baltic. Digging in, Gustav also demanded the subsidy for 1809 be increased from its 1808 level of £1.2 million annually to £2 million. If his conditions were not met, Gustav threatened to make peace with Russia, join the continental system, and declare war on Britain. Portland and Canning obviously refused the terms, as did Moore. He was placed under house arrest in Stockholm, managing to escape in disguise to Göteborg, where he evacuated back to Britain with his entire force. The Finnish War would drag on for another year and a half, well into 1809, but the conclusion was not in doubt. Despite Napoleon's song and dance, Finland would be conquered. Of more serious concern were outstanding issues in Eastern Europe, centering on the fate of Prussia. As per the Treaty of Tilsit, Prussia was dismembered. Westphalia was split off to form a French client state, the Kingdom of Westphalia. Prussia's Polish provinces were reformed into the Duchy of Warsaw, nominally under Saxon rule, but in truth a client state of France all the same. And finally, Danzig was made independent as a Freistaat, a free city. As for the rump state that remained of Prussia, they were forced into an alliance with France, into the continental system, and made to bear the cost of extensive French garrisons. This was all in addition to the cost of a war indemnity. Prussia's defeat left them devastated, occupied, and at the whims of Napoleon. Alexander had largely abandoned Prussia, but did secure one concession. Napoleon agreed to withdraw his forces by October 1st, provided the indemnity was paid in full. The catch was that the exact amount was not specified. This allowed Napoleon to foist upon Prussia the impossible bill for 155 million francs, in addition to 30 million owed to Westphalia. No way Prussia could even begin to imagine paying such a ludicrous sum, which meant the French occupation was effectively open-ended, regardless of the terms agreed at Tilsit. Only Silesia remained a prosperous and productive region. The rest of Prussia was despoiled and denuded. While King Friedrich Wilhelm sulked in Königsberg, a new government set about the painstaking work of picking up the pieces of a shattered country, but could do nothing substantial under the crushing weight of the indemnity. Prime Minister Heinrich von Stein first pursued a policy of reconciliation with France, offering a proper alliance if only the indemnity was reduced. Napoleon would not budge, so in order to meet their obligations, Stein gutted the budget and reduced the army to 40,000 troops. Napoleon's hard line against Prussia was entirely a personal project. Minister of Foreign Affairs Champagny echoed Talleyrand's wisdom that some financial windfall was not worth antagonizing all of Germany. Caulaincourt warned directly that opinion in Russia was opposed to the hard line. Still, Napoleon persisted. Quote, "The King of Prussia is pitiable, Caulaincourt," the Emperor remarked. "But he will be satisfied with what I give him. If I were to yield one thing today, another tomorrow, soon I would find I had been serving to save the King of Prussia." If his ministers could not dissuade Napoleon, perhaps Alexander could. Personally, he was only slightly perturbed by Napoleon's maltreatment of Prussia, and indeed agreed that they ought to suffer quite heavily for their defeat. He proposed some revised terms, mostly presented to him by the Prussians themselves, but again Napoleon was unmoved, and Alexander didn't press too hard. In desperation, Stein sought out alternate options. His plan was to secretly fund German uprisings, stoking the flames of nationalism sparked by Napoleon's redrawing of German borders. Support for the scheme was sought by Austria, but plans were intercepted by Fouché. Friedrich Wilhelm was taken aback by the revelation that Stein was masterminding a German revolution. In order to placate Napoleon, he sacked and exiled Stein and agreed to new terms. Reparations were revised down to 140 million francs, and French garrisons limited to the key fortresses of Magdeburg, Glogau, Kustrin, and Stettin. The catch was that all tolls in Prussia would go directly to France and not be counted towards the indemnity, and Prussia's foreign policy was under strict scrutiny. The issue of French garrisons, and the forward positioning of the bulk of La Grande Armée in Germany, was contentious more generally. Napoleon considered it vital to the stability of the empire that La Grande Armée be maintained in Germany. Not only was it centrally located, projecting power outside of France, but it was pre-positioned to contend with Prussia, Austria, even Russia, in the event of war. Diplomatic forays and overtures were preferred, but if push came to shove, Napoleon could have troops in Berlin, Vienna, or crossing into Poland on a moment's notice. Alexander was acutely aware, and largely to preserve Austria and Prussia, desired at least a partial French withdrawal from Germany, and was therefore blindsided by Napoleon's demand that, in addition to all the land he'd taken so far, Silesia should be transferred to the French Empire, possibly as a province of Poland. Napoleon had reasons for this about-face, as we'll get into when looking at Balkan relations, but it hardly justifies what was naked opportunism. Russia came to the defense of Prussia over the Silesian question, partly to forestall Napoleon, but also to prevent Poland's aggrandizement. Indeed, the mere fact that a semi-independent Polish polity had now re-emerged on the Russian western periphery was interpreted as a serious threat. Russian ministers and generals considered the final partition of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1792 to be a crowning achievement in Russian imperial ambition, ending a centuries-long rivalry with a formidable foe. The revival of Poland, even one subservient to France, rekindled the flames of Polish national identity Russia had worked so hard to stamp out in their own Polish provinces. Beyond this practical concern, Poland, and Eastern Europe more generally, was seen as naturally part of the Russian sphere of influence. Tensions over the Baltic and Eastern Europe were, to a point, tolerable. For all the fuss over Sweden, Russia was taking Finland with French assent, and the Polish and Prussian questions were, ultimately, the result of Russia's defeat in 1807. What really rankled and grievously wounded Franco-Russian relations in 1808 was some damned fool business in Europe's powder keg, the Balkans. The fact that the Balkans figured so heavily into the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit accords with the strategic importance both sides placed on the region. Knowing what we know of Napoleon's Mediterranean ambitions, controlling ports and bases with which to strike into the Eastern Med would be essential for a return to Egypt, possibly even Syria and the Levant. Russia too harboured grand territorial designs for long-coveted Istanbul and the Dardanelles, which would grant access to the Mediterranean. Emboldening Russia further were religious claims as the premier Orthodox Christian nation, protecting the majority Orthodox Greek, Bulgarian and Serbian peoples, all direct subjects of the Ottoman Empire. In the immediate aftermath of the Treaty of Tilsit, there was nothing to suggest either side were anything less than committed to the Balkan division. Through Oras Sebastiani, Napoleon's envoy to the Sublime Porte, Napoleon pressured the Turks to cede territory. It's a testament to Sebastiani's skills and rapport that he was able to propose peace after so stridently advocating war. Previously, at the height of the war with Russia, he made assurances that France would see Wallachia and Moldavia removed from the Russian sphere, and the Russians ejected from the Balkans. Even a restitution of Crimea was floated. The sudden Franco-Russian alliance dashed these hopes in Istanbul, and seriously compromised the authority of Sultan Mustafa IV. Having come into power by overthrowing and assassinating his predecessor, Selim III, Mustafa was well aware that he was at the mercy of the court factions that had supported the coup. The most powerful faction, under the Janissaries, pushed for war at any cost. The reality was, though, that without French backing, the principalities were irrevocably lost. Sébastien secured an armistice at Slobossia on August 24th. Both sides agreed to evacuate Moldavia and Wallachia until a permanent peace could be negotiated with French mediation. The terms of the armistice were communicated to the Russian commander, General Michelson, through Turkish intermediaries. Things seemed to be going well until Alexander learned of this and countermanded the withdrawal. He reneged on the terms of the armistice, likely under the safe assumption that without controlling the claims directly, they wouldn't be counted. Crucially, he also stopped cold the transfer of the Ionian island of Tenedos to the French, keeping a Russian base in the Aegean. Napoleon was shocked by the sudden change. He'd followed, to the letter, the secret agreement to mediate the Balkan conflict in Russia's favour, and here they were violating the armistice the French secured. His principal objection was that by violating the treaty and annexing outright Turkish domains, Alexander was clearly eyeing up further land grabs in the Balkans. Explanations from the Russian Foreign Ministry were not forthcoming. All they offered was to turn a blind eye should Napoleon seize Greece or what is today Albania. The offer was clearly intended to bring France into open conflict with the Ottomans, but when pressed for more info, the Russians were cagey. The only way Napoleon could get answers was through Savary. Despite constant demands and letters of recommendation, though, Savary was kept down at the loop, for which he was chided by the emperor. Ultimately, the Russian reoccupation of the principalities was a fait accompli which violated the spirit of the Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon wasn't going to abandon Tilsit on such flimsy pretext, and indeed ordered Champigny to de facto recognise the annexations by ejecting Ottoman negotiators from Paris and recalling French military advisors. However, he was not above a little opportunism. It was at this juncture, as the Russians were altering the deal by annexing Wallachia and Moldavia, that Napoleon demanded Silesia, as we've seen. Both sides now had good reason to consider Tilsit violated, though not abrogated. In the meantime, no doubt Count Tolstoy had deliberately meandered through Germany. He was not an ideal pick for ambassador, being a military man first and foremost, and not a fan of the French. After dallying in Frankfurt for a few days, he learned of the Silesian demand. Following not far behind was summons to appear in Paris before the emperor without further delay. To Champigny, Napoleon wrote, quote, "As for the affairs of the Porte, I feel the need to settle something, and I am ready to come to an agreement with Russia on this matter. This affair is of great interest to me. I will write to you after I have seen Tolstoy. I may even need to have an interview with the Emperor of Russia." Everything pointed to a showdown with Mr. Tolstoy, but despite the contentious issues discussed, the meeting was cordial and productive. Napoleon debriefed Savary. Quote, "Monsieur Tolstoy, in the audience I granted him today, gave me the Emperor's private letters and yours. I spoke with him for over an hour about various matters. We agreed that he would write to Prince Kurakin, and that I would give him a draft note to persuade the Viennese court to declare war on England. I spoke frankly to him about the affairs of Constantinople regarding Russia, making it clear that anything that could strengthen our ties suited me, that the world was large enough for both our powers, that we must always be in agreement and avoid any cause for discord, that I thought Russia was gathering troops to march against Sweden, and that, as for me, my troops were on the borders of Portugal and were about to enter it. Monsieur Tolstoy spoke to me at length about the evacuation of Prussia. I told him that I too desired it, but that the Prussians were delaying, that I expected arrangements to finally be made, and that it would not be long in coming. I added that, moreover, it was undoubtedly part of Russia's policy to retain Wallachia and Moldavia, that if this was Russia's plan, it was only fair that I keep some Prussian provinces, that, if Russia has broader ambitions regarding the Turkish Empire, Monsieur Romantsov should send her more precise instructions, and that, as for myself, I wanted everything that could strengthen our ties." Both Napoleon and Tolstoy concluded their discussions feeling as though their empires were mostly on the same page. Quote, "I am truly happy to see the work at Tilsit taking shape," Napoleon wrote to Alexander on December 7th. "We will overcome England, we will pacify the world, and the peace of Tilsit will be, I hope, a new era in the annals of the world." For all this talk of peace, Napoleon still had reservations about the Balkan situation. Over the next few months, the French position clarified. Rather than attempt to resist Alexander's unilateral annexations, Napoleon would support them, but on his terms. Tying German affairs into Balkan affairs, Napoleon reached out to the Austrians, proposing a three-way split of the Balkans. Austria would receive Bosnia, much of Serbia and Bulgaria, stretching down even to the Greek coast around Thessalonica. France would content itself with its extant Adriatic territories if Silesia was ceded. Failing that, Greece, Albania, and the entire Adriatic coast would be transferred to France. Russia, in turn, would have its Moldavian and Wallachian conquests ratified. The Balkans thus divided, the fate of the Ottoman Empire would be for the three great powers to ordain. Napoleon suggested a joint invasion of Anatolia, the conquest of the Ottoman Middle East, and a plunge into India. He revealed all to Alexander on February 2, 1808. Quote, "Will your Majesty permit advice from someone who professes to be tenderly and truly devoted to you? An army of 50,000 men, Russian, French, perhaps Austrian, advancing from Constantinople to Asia, would not have reached the Euphrates before it would have made England tremble and brought her to her knees on the continent. I am in a position to do so in Dalmatia. Your Majesty is on the Danube. A month after we have agreed upon this, the army could be on the Bosphorus. The shock would reverberate in India, and England would be subdued. I do not refuse any of the necessary preliminary steps to achieve such a great goal, but the mutual interests of our two states must be considered and balanced. This can only be done in a meeting with your Majesty, or after sincere discussions between Romanciev and Caulaincourt. Your Majesty and I would have preferred the sweetness of peace and to spend our lives amidst our vast empires, occupied in revitalizing them and making them prosperous through the arts and the benefits of administration. The enemies of the world do not want this. We must be greater despite ourselves. It is both wise and politically sound to do what destiny commands and to go where the irresistible march of events leads us. Then this swarm of pygmies, who refuse to see that current events are such that their parallels must be sought in history and not in the newspapers of last century, will yield and follow the course that your Majesty and I will have ordered, and the Russian people will be pleased with the glory, riches, and fortune that will result from these great events." A few weeks prior to this bombshell letter, Caulaincourt assumed his post as ambassador to St. Petersburg. As he recalled, the entire French embassy was pure lavish and opulence, intended to invoke the grand embassies of Louis XIV. With an unlimited expense account, fetes, balls, and dinners were hosted at French expense. At one such banquet, the French presented, in the middle of winter, as though it were no matter, a table teeming with fresh pears, cherries, and exotic fruits. Caulaincourt personally abhorred the expense, as did Napoleon, but he deemed it part of their diplomatic strategy to overawe Russia. Quipping to Caulaincourt, he said, quote, "When a young lieutenant, I should have been very lucky to have a yearly salary equal to the 25 francs of one of your Russian pears, but such things are expected in the minds of madmen or fools." The grandiosity of the French embassy was matched by their grand designs. Caulaincourt promptly conveyed the Ottoman partition plan to Romanciev. On the face of it, the whole idea was ridiculous. Russia would get 2 provinces it already owned, none of the land it was promised at Tilsit or which it coveted, and a massive military expedition on top of the existing one in Finland. Napoleon's motives appear suspect, embroiling Russia in another war, using them to fight Britain. It was also clear that Napoleon viewed the Balkans as secondary to potential gains to be made in Egypt and the Levant, which, if the expedition occurred, he would no doubt demand. On top of that, by bringing the Austrians into the fold, he was positioning Vienna and St. Petersburg against each other. Indeed, there were those in Vienna, led by Archduke Charles, who felt that Austria's many defeats at French hands and the loss of the Holy Roman Empire meant Austria should disengage from Germany, Italy, and refocus on the Balkans for territory and influence. Here was Napoleon offering just such a chance on a silver platter, fully expecting that it would be the Russians, not the French, who would smash that dish to the ground. When the Russians got their heads around the proposal, Caulaincourt was beset by their questions, Romanciev's especially. How were the borders to be drawn up? Why were the Austrians, not a party at Tilsit, invited at all? How would such an expedition deal with Persia? Caulaincourt answered these questions diligently, forwarding his reports to Napoleon. How seriously the emperor actually considered his proposed partitions of the Ottoman Empire is hard to judge for sure. Sébastien prepared a lengthy memorandum against the partition which Napoleon ingested. The Ottomans were, if nothing else, a valuable counterweight and provided stable access to the Eastern Med. Russia gaining any land here served no French interest. For my money, the partition plan looks like a big diplomatic ruse to keep the Russian Empire focused on bigger things. Through his envoys, Napoleon was aware of the influence of the anti-French faction in St. Petersburg and the unease with which they consorted with France. For all their professions of trust and friendship, if Napoleon and Alexander deemed it in the national interest, their two empires would be at war again. Such a war would necessitate Russia abandon Finland and France Spain, but it was far from impossible. To Caulaincourt, Napoleon recounted the events of January 13th, in which Marshal Ney and Ambassador Tolstoy conversed. Tolstoy, with a habit for, quote, talking at length, owing to his lack of diplomatic experience, unwittingly revealed elite Russian attitudes towards France and towards Emperor Alexander. Quote, several days ago, while out hunting at Saint-Germain, travelling in a carriage with Marshal Ney, they started talking and even made challenges to each other. 3 things were noted that Monsieur Tolstoy let slip during this conversation. First, that we would soon have a war. Second, that Emperor Alexander was very weak, and that if Tolstoy were emperor for a fortnight, things would take a different turn. And finally, that if Europe were to be partitioned, Russia's right wing should be on the Elbe and its left wing in Venice. I leave you to imagine what Marshal Ney, who was as ignorant of my plans as the army's lowest drummer, might have replied to that. As for the war, he told Monsieur Tolstoy that if it were to start soon, he would be delighted, as the Russians had always been defeated. That he was bored in Paris doing nothing. That, as for the claim of having the right flank on the Elbe and the left in Venice, we were far from achieving that. That, his opinion, on the contrary, was to push it back beyond the Dniester. According to Tolstoy, the emperor mismanaged the war effort. This should have been done, that should have been done, etc. But when asked, quote, tell me about the ministers, Tolstoy replies that the ministers are never wrong, since the emperor chooses them whenever he pleases. It is up to him to select them wisely. This important information highlights 2 things. 1, that Napoleon's diplomatic focus on Alexander was justified, and 2, Tilsit was but a scrap of paper. Russia had ambitions to expand their territory and sphere of influence. Given this context, Napoleon's partition plan looks like an attempt to redirect Russian ambitions away from Europe, away from his interests, which dovetailed neatly with French Mediterranean ambitions. Whatever the case, Napoleon sought a meeting with Alexander, ostensibly to discuss the Ottoman partition, but in truth to clear the air. The seeds of what would become the Conference of Erfurt had been sown early. So early, in fact, that Napoleon had invited Alexander to Paris, even in the midst of negotiations at Tilsit. In his meeting with Tolstoy, Napoleon raised the subject again. In June 1808, he finally ordered Caulaincourt to extend the offer more formally, as a diplomatic conference, not so much a state visit. For many months, Alexander had demurred, and with what had happened since in the Baltic, in Germany and Poland, and now all the confusion and recrimination surrounding Balkan affairs, his mood had changed. By July, Alexander was game, but he would not come to Paris. Napoleon, too, would not travel to St. Petersburg, despite an open invitation he'd do so. A neutral-ish location was selected at Erfurt, in the western half of the Kingdom of Saxony. Not only was the reigning Duke of Saxe-Weimar married to a Romanov, but Saxony was a member of the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon's journey back from Bayonne is a story worth telling in its own right. Rather than take the direct route back to Paris, Napoleon made something of a grand tour of the Pyrenees and the Atlantic departments. Largely, this was to maintain appearances and keep to the set itinerary. With the Iberian invasion facing setbacks, he deemed it to act as though nothing were amiss. Curiosity also played its part. Napoleon had simply never seen much of these regions. He left Bayonne on July 21st, popping into Pau, Orthez, and Auch on the way to Toulouse, banquets and reviews aplenty. But Napoleon's unerring eye for detail got a look in too, and at all turns he pressed local officials and officers. Savary recounts one such surprise inspection of a newly built canal and bridge in Toulouse. The work was superb. In meeting the chief engineer, Napoleon peppered him with technical questions, until it became clear the man had not built the thing, only put his name to it. The local prefect presented the actual man responsible, who happily answered all the questions posed. Clearly the real brains behind the operation, he was promoted to chief engineer. Cutting north, Napoleon passed through Montauban and Agen before reaching Bordeaux on the 31st. Like at Toulouse, there was a lot of grab-handing. By August 4th, Napoleon was in Rochefort, by the 6th, La Rochelle. On August 8th, he was present for the renaming of a town in the Vendée to, appropriately enough, Napoléon Vendée, today La Roche-sur-Yon. While in Nantes, Savary caught up to Napoleon. He bore the latest updates on Iberia, in particular the reports on Dupont's fate in Andalusia. Napoleon's pace then quickened. After abbreviated visits in Angers and Saumur, Tours was the final stop on the Grand Tour. By August 14th, Napoleon was at Saint-Cloud, where he would stay, minus a few trips to the Tuileries and Versailles, for the next 6 weeks. In that time, a contingent of the Maison was sent ahead to Erfurt to prepare the town for the Emperor's arrival. He departed on September 21st with a full retinue of advisers and aides. Of course, there was Savary in tow, as well as Jacques Lauriston, Agathon Farr, and Claude Meneval. Nicolas Oudinot organized the personal guard and assumed all military responsibilities. Jean Lannes, being trusted by Napoleon, and having served as envoy on various missions before, would be present at Erfurt, as was Jean Soult as representative of La Grande Armée in Germany. Imperial Chief of Staff Louis-Alexandre Berthier and Intendant General Pierre Daroux were also present. As Minister of Foreign Affairs, Champagny was naturally brought along, and so too was ex-Foreign Minister Talleyrand. His inclusion came as a surprise, even to the man himself, and warrants some explanation. As we've seen, though Talleyrand was dismissed from the Foreign Ministry, Napoleon retained his diplomatic services. As far as loyalty went, Napoleon had no apparent qualms. He'd given Talleyrand all he could want: money, titles, and estates. And after all, as Foreign Minister, he'd supported all of Napoleon's most controversial diplomatic plays, like the Continental System and the execution of the Duc d'Enghien. In the case of Spain, Talleyrand had been the first to suggest regime change. It was enough to assure Napoleon that, despite their falling out, Talleyrand would be an asset, not a liability. Alongside the French delegation was a panoply of German leaders from throughout the Confederation of the Rhine, including 20 princes, 2 Grand Dukes, and the kings of Bavaria, Westphalia, and Württemberg, as well as Saxony, naturally. Head of the Confederation's delegation was Prince Primate Karl Dalberg. Friedrich Wilhelm was invited, as was Emperor Francis, but both refused. Freddie at least sent his brother, Prince Wilhelm, to represent Prussia, while Francis sent his emissary, Karl von Vincent, with a letter of apology. Quote, "Be pleased to accept the assurances of the unalterable attachment and consideration with which I am your Imperial and Royal Majesty's brother and friend." As always in his diplomatic meetings, Napoleon moved fast to get there first. He and his entourage gunned it through the Rhineland, reaching Fulda on September 26th, and arriving in Erfurt within a few hours. Early on the morning of the 28th, Alexander arrived in a dazzling carriage, trailed by 12 or more coaches containing the Russian retinue. Tagging along too were 2 Frenchmen, Conductor as ambassador to Russia, and Jean Lannes as escort from the Polish border. Napoleon awaited patiently on the roadside, 5 miles outside of town. Savary, at the Emperor's side, gives an eyewitness account. Quote, "The Emperor Napoleon set off at a full gallop, and alighted to embrace the Emperor of Russia when he got out of his carriage. The meeting was as amicable and cordial as the sentiments which the emperors mutually cherished towards each other. They both mounted their horses and proceeded, conversing together, to Erfurt. The road was lined with the whole population of the surrounding country. The weather was delicious, and seemed to smile auspiciously on the event. The sovereigns were saluted by the artillery from the ramparts. The troops formed a double line, and all the persons of distinction who had come to Erfurt on this occasion were assembled at the residence which had been prepared for the Emperor Alexander, at the moment when he alighted from his horse accompanied by the Emperor Napoleon. All the dignitaries had assembled at the Kaisersaal, from which the sigils of Napoleon and Alexander hung side by side. Gifts and greetings were exchanged. Napoleon accepted bounties from throughout Russia, and Alexander a priceless set of Sèvres porcelain. The theatricality and extravagance of Erfurt were strategic, again intended to overawe Alexander, to prime him for Napoleon's proposals. As Kolenko noted, the intention was to remind Alexander that, quote, the French name was a talisman to which the nations of the world rendered homage and obedience. The pattern of the first day of the conference set the trend. Meetings in the morning in the Kaisersaal, followed by a meal, and in the afternoon and evening for receptions, soirees and operas. No expense was spared as Napoleon's plan to flatter and amaze was in full swing. Early indications were it was working. At a performance of Oedipus, Alexander turned at one point to repeat Philoctetes' line, quote, the friendship of a great man is a blessing of heaven. Napoleon bowed politely as the audience applauded, drowning out the performance. Yet, for all of Napoleon's preparations, for all the pomp and expense, for all the overt effusions of friendliness and commitment, Erfurt was to prove disappointing for both sides. Emperor Alexander had been warned by Tolstoy and numerous ministers in his own government not to trust Napoleon. Some went so far as to claim Alexander would be kidnapped, a notion he quite rightly laughed off. Alexander entered Erfurt clear-eyed and hopeful, intending to secure unambiguous French assent for Russian conquest in the Balkans and in Finland. He needed something tangible to point out as a foreign policy win. Not only would this undermine the rising influence of the anti-French portions of the court elite, but it would justify Alexander's alliance with France. Having backed France at all turns, on Denmark and Sweden, ultimately on Prussia and Austria, and in the war with Britain, Alexander felt the process would be frictionless. Erfurt a formulaic, fairly boring affair, with the two emperors meeting to make some touch-ups to their spheres of influence, haggle over a few quibbling issues, and leave the diplomats to hash out the details. If Alexander wanted tweaking to the terms of Tilsit, Napoleon sought full-scale revisions. Since Tilsit, and certainly since early 1808, Napoleon's priorities had shifted away from the east to the west. Iberia was the root cause. Successes early in the year had been almost completely wiped out, as we've seen, by the defeats at Bailen and Vimiero, as well as the failures to seize Valencia, Zaragoza and Girona. French forces were at this stage retreating precipitously towards the Ebro line. The strategic necessity to divert resources and reinforcements into Spain nixed any practical hope of a Franco-Russian invasion of Anatolia. These were troops Napoleon simply could not afford to divert unless Spain was secure. What he really needed then from Russia was not its army to fight the Ottomans, but the threat of its army to overawe Austria. Austria's rising revanchism against France in 1808 and into 1809 was alarming, exacerbated by the cresting waves of German nationalism fomented by both Austria and Prussia. The details of all this we'll cover in the lead-up to the War of the Fifth Coalition, but for now it's enough to know that Napoleon was deeply concerned. If he was to have a free hand in Spain, he needed Austria quiet, and Alexander could be the muzzle. This meant a total shuttering of any partition of the Ottoman Empire, one of two central aims of Alexander's foreign policy. Despite assurances that this was temporary, until Spain was secure and Britain defeated, Napoleon's demand that Russia sign a treaty of non-aggression with the Ottomans was an obvious rug pull. In exchange, Russia was to be offered nothing, not even French ratification for the annexation of the Principalities and Finland. All Napoleon did give were promises and no meaningful concessions. Among other points, Alexander pushed for lenient terms for Prussia. Napoleon as ever refused to budge. Strong denunciations were levelled over the Silesian transfer, but again it was not worth conflict. More concerning was France's open-ended occupation, despite the stipulations of Tilsit. As we've seen, Napoleon wanted his troops in Prussia, and Alexander wanted them gone. Alexander managed to screw Napoleon out of the annexation of Silesia, but could do nothing about French troop presence in Germany broadly. The question of Poland cropped up too, and again was irresolvable. France backed Poland, and since Alexander still felt bound to the terms of Tilsit, in which he jointly guaranteed Poland, the status quo would prevail. The subject of peace with Britain was a hot topic, with Alexander believing that a settlement was essential. Napoleon made all the right noises for peace in their time, but would not accede until all French and Russian spheres were recognised, all colonies returned, and Joseph confirmed in Spain and in the Americas. There was no way Britain would agree to even one, let alone all three, of these terms. After all this, it's hard to shake the feeling that Alexander had been played, that he'd given away the barn for nothing. Much becomes clear, however, when accounting for external factors. For starters, Alexander was ill-advised. His principal interlocutors on French affairs were unreliable. Romantsev and Prince Constantine pro-French, Tolstoy and other senior ministers anti-French. But most controversial of all was his unofficial advisor, Talleyrand. Clearly, old habits die hard, and the former foreign minister was not done peddling state secrets or undermining his old boss. Motives are not hard to deign. Greed, a return to the limelight, a bit of revenge. Talleyrand would try to downplay his personal motives, claiming that Napoleon was giving him the cold shoulder, even though Savary, Rapp and others all record Napoleon, in person and in private, talking highly of Talleyrand. The simple fact he had been brought along speaks to this point. But even more incredulously, Talleyrand later claimed his actions as a service rendered not only to all of Europe, but amazingly to Napoleon too. In any case, Napoleon's confidence was repaid with intrigue, and Talleyrand sold what he knew to other powers, namely to Minister Vincent of Austria. What he gave to Alexander was pro bono. He recalled in his memoirs, quote, "I had seen Emperor Alexander several times in private at Tilsit. I saw him nearly every day at Erfurt. Our conversations were at first a general turn concerning the common interests existing between the great powers of Europe, the conditions on which the ties, which it was important to preserve between them, were to be broken, the equilibrium of Europe in general, the probable causes of its destruction. Then gradually our conversation turned more particularly to the states whose existence was necessary for this equilibrium, especially to Austria. These conversations put the emperor in such a state of mind that the coaxing, the persuasion, and the threats of Napoleon were a dead loss." Talleyrand is not a reliable narrator, especially when telling his own story, and overstates his influence. Though secret meetings certainly occurred, his pleas were not convincing in their own right, serving more to confirm Alexander in his pre-existing strategy of delay. Because Alexander did have a plan, and was not merely dancing the dance tapped out by Napoleon. For now, the balance of power favoured France, and it was clearly necessary to stay on good terms. But Alexander saw Russia's path diverged from France in the near future. Writing to his mother, he noted, quote, "The wisest policy is to await the right moment to take measures." What were those measures? War, of course. He would not actively foment conflict, and if it could be avoided, all the better. But quietly, under the pretext of the Balkan and Baltic engagements, Alexander was preparing for a showdown with the French. Having always intervened in Europe alongside partners, Alexander aimed to revive the coalition with Austria and Prussia. Much could be sacrificed in this policy of delay: French confirmations of Russian annexations, the partition of the Ottomans, even the integrity of Prussia, at least temporarily. But on the matter of Austria there could be no compromise. Alexander did not want to be drawn into a conflict with a potential future ally, and yet that was exactly what Napoleon was demanding. For days, Napoleon's Austrian scheme was on the table, shot down at every turn. Alexander would not be a gun held to Vienna's head. Old tricks resurfaced. At Tilsit, Alexander and Napoleon had met secretly at night like star-crossed lovers. Here at Erfurt, Napoleon paid furtive calls, crossing over to the Ankerplatz estate where the Russians stayed. Alexander reciprocated, visiting Napoleon at the Staatskanzlei. On October 13th, Napoleon wrote to Josephine, thinking Alexander was in his pocket. Quote, My friend, I write to you too little. I'm very busy. Conversations that last entire days. It's not helping my cold. However, all goes well. I'm happy with Alexander, and he must be happy with me. If he were a woman, I think I could make him my lover. Publicly, affections were as earnest as ever. According to Savary, every day the two emperors were, quote, all attention to each other, and there was on every hand an appearance of perfect concord. Appearances deceived. The cracks were showing behind the scenes. Caulaincourt recalled how, during one meeting, Napoleon, quote, experimented with anger, throwing his hat to the ground in frustration and crushing the thing with a couple of stomps. Unmoved, Alexander watched on amused, and when Napoleon was finished, he was told if no civil discussion was possible, there was nothing to discuss. On October 7th, about the midpoint of negotiations, all parties needed a bit of a breather. The Duke of Saxe-Weimar proposed a hunting trip to his estates near Jena. Napoleon happily obliged, revisiting the old battlefield with Alexander. It was, in the words of Savary, quote, Jena fought against pheasants, as the party lined up shots out into the woods where, just over 2 years prior, Prussian Jaegers had skirmished with their French opponents. Napoleon was in his element, retracing the paths forged by his columns, explaining to Alexander the terrain and his battle plan. Were he fitter and not nursing a cold, Napoleon might have scaled the imposing Landgrafenburg once more. In a subsequent banquet and ball hosted in Weimar, Napoleon admitted he was feeling his age. In a letter to Josephine, he said, quote, I am pleased to see that you are well. I've just been out hunting on the battlefield of Jena, where we had lunch at the bivouac where I spent the night. I attended the ball in Weimar. The Emperor danced a great deal, but I did not. 40 is 40. My health is generally good, apart from a few minor ailments. I hope to see you soon. Talks resumed at Erfurt the next day, continuing to October 13, 1808. The only serious development was on Austria. Napoleon walked away with a vague Russian promise to back France in a war with Austria if Austria attacked France. Additionally, Tolstoy would be recalled as ambassador to Paris, replaced by Alexander Kurokin, the Russian ambassador to Vienna. In return, France finally ratified the annexations of Moldavia, Wallachia, and Finland, dropped by 20 million francs the indemnity owed by Prussia, with promise of further reductions pending compliance, and reopened negotiations for peace with Britain. Other than that, nothing was conceded, and both parties left Erfurt distinctly dissatisfied. The conference was not a total disaster. By the clauses of the Treaty of Erfurt, Russia and France were still allies, their spheres of influence confirmed. But none of the real, meaty issues were resolved, with dire consequences down the road. The emperors of France and Russia bid farewell, on the same ground where they had embraced 2 weeks earlier. Fondest wishes and good health were bid, the imperial entourages decoupling and departing. Napoleon and Alexander would never see each other again. Despite assurances to Joseph that he and Alexander parted on, quote, the best possible terms, Napoleon was trying to save face. The emperor had hoped, no expected, that Erfurt would be another of his hallmark diplomatic triumphs, a capstone to the Grand Alliance hashed out at Tilsit, and the stabilization of a new continental status quo. Instead, it had been a costly failure that had undermined French credibility in the midst of the ever-deepening quagmire in Iberia. Erfurt had inadvertently sowed the seeds of a conflict that would, in its course, unravel Napoleon's empire. But he couldn't ruminate for long. Napoleon zipped back through Germany, crossing the border into France at Phalsbourg, before returning to Saint-Cloud on October 18th. His attentions were now firmly fixed on Iberia and forcing a conclusion there. If the Spanish and Portuguese would not submit willingly, they would be compelled at the point of a bayonet. Reserves were called up, armies raised, and new corps formed, all for the express purpose of crushing the Iberian holdouts. And just to make sure things were done right, Napoleon would roll up his sleeves and do it himself.